want to thank Dr. McCord for inviting me in here. It's an honor to share some of the thoughts about what I consider a very serious threat that's facing this country today. As you warned in your great book, The Wisdom of Ants, we're running out of time to neutralize this threat. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about what I consider the crisis of confidence and a loss of trust in a critical segment of our society, and that's law enforcement. There are exceptions, of course, but thousands of police officers today absolutely ignore the ethical behavior that we all subscribe to, and they believe they're above the law. And that, I think, threatens to rip America apart. So we really are on a downward slide to lose our freedom because we're allowing this to happen. But let me set the stage. Just look at some what ifs. What if the American airline industry was having 3 fatal accidents per day every day of the year? What if more than 1,000 people are being killed in these accidents annually? And what if after every single accident, that airline's pilots, executives, their mechanics, they all got together and they did their own investigation? And they came back every single time and said, you know, it wasn't our fault. It was the air traffic controllers. It was the weather. It was the manufacturer of the airplane. Not our fault. Justified. Okay, let's go back. And what if every pilot that was involved in one of these accidents was allowed to move to a different airline and just keep flying? How many of us would get on an airplane today? Not too many, I don't think. I wouldn't. And yet we tolerate exactly that in our law enforcement. They're doing that, and the results are shocking. U.S. police officers today kill an average of 3 people per day, every single day of the year. Last year, they killed 1,209 nationwide. The year before, 1,111. So we're on this upward trend. It has been for some time. And when one of their own kills a, quote, civilian, that's what they call us, civilians, the cops in the same department investigate their buddies, then they report to themselves, and their conclusion is invariably justified. It wasn't our fault. Third-party investigations, outside investigations of any officer-involved fatalities is just virtually non-existent. It rarely happens. Consequently, the law enforcement community has a long list, I think, of serious problems today that threaten the rule of law that binds this country together. Let's go through a few of them. Victims killed by cops, as you heard in that movie, are falsely demonized, disparaged, and depicted as lowlifes who deserve to die. Cops who routinely kill lie and cover it up. That's the standard. Why? Because they know there's a 99% probability they're going to get away with it. They will be exonerated. Therefore, cops don't hesitate to shoot, because there's absolutely no downside to shooting. So this insular self-protective system, they call it the blue wall. Sometimes you'll hear it called the thin blue line. We're the only ones that stand between you, citizens, and total chaos. Okay, but it's a true wall because they take care of each other's. And as a result of everything I just described, police officers today have very little credibility, and their trust factor is going in the tank. And that is happening with millions of Americans now, not just a few here and there, and particularly true in the minority communities. Cops no longer trusted by the very people who pay their salaries. And as Dr. McCord's book says, bad behavior breeds distrust. And distrust, quote, will eventually destroy the willingness of a free people to live and work harmoniously and peacefully together. So because law enforcement agencies are increasingly viewed with disdain and suspicion, they're having a hard time attracting and hiring and retaining good people. Part of that is because standards have been lowered. It's a vicious circle. If you can't get good people, you lower the standards so you can get somebody. And I just found out this week that the California Highway Patrol, they now interview 100 people in order to get 2 officers on the road. By the time they get them through the background checks, through the training, etc., only 2 out of 100. That's a 2% rate. That's not good. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that if you hire bad people and give them power to make life and death decisions, you often have deadly and unintended consequences. And I know, as you saw in that film, a slow-witted, frightened cop murdered my son, Eric Scott. In his first 5 years on the Las Vegas police force, William Mosier killed 2 people, one of them my son. Under oath, he admitted that he had pulled his weapon on the order of 100 times in that 5 years. Good cops just drop their jaw over that. You know, most good cops finish a 30-year career and they can tell you on one hand how many times they've pulled their weapon. Most of them have never fired it in anger. If they have, very, very few of them have killed anybody. This fool has killed 2 people in his first 5 years on the force, pulled his weapon 100 times at least. So about a year ago, I interviewed Randy Titus. He's a retired Las Vegas field training officer for the police department there. He's known as Mr. Super Trainer in that area. So in an interview, he remembered Bill Mosier, who killed my son. And he told me on the record that he tried like crazy to make sure Mosier was not allowed to graduate from the police academy. He said, quote, Mosier had been a substandard cadet who did not handle stressful situations well. He couldn't process information. He couldn't think fast enough. He couldn't multitask. He just didn't measure up. So Titus recalled that Mosier had been gruff and one-dimensional, didn't discriminate good from bad, and he treated everybody from silver-haired grandmothers to hardened criminals as if they were deadly enemies and threats. Quote, he didn't have any people skills and did not have the right mindset to be a good police officer, unquote. Unfortunately, during that period, Las Vegas was growing like crazy. They needed 600 officers quickly. So Randy Titus was overridden by the higher-ups. You saw what kind of higher-ups they have in Las Vegas. They said, get them on the street. We have to have boots out there. So that's what you get. And many of the shootings and killings in the last 10 years have been by officers hired during that period. Now let me make one point loud and clear, just as Ramsey did. I'm not a cop hater. I do respect good police officers, those that handle themselves professionally and live up to their oath every single day. But I absolutely, positively despise corrupt rogues and outlaws like Bill Mosier. Badge-heavy cops who shoot and kill like they did my son, and then they lie under oath. Now you saw my son's story in that film. I'm going to recap it real quick to a few points that may not come through. Eric and his girlfriend were in Costco shopping. What you didn't know was that at the same time, or slightly before that, there was a guy also in Costco, also with a girlfriend that looked a little bit like Samantha, Eric's, although she was much shorter. This guy was under the influence of something, drugs, alcohol, or whatever. He caused a disturbance back at the pharmacy. So then when Eric comes in, squats on the floor to check the bottles, see if they'll fit, somebody saw the gun. He was carrying it legally. There were absolutely no signs on the outside of Costco that said guns aren't allowed. Eric carefully read the membership application before he signed up for a $100 business membership that day. That was my son. He was very thorough. And I've read it since that time. There's no mention of no firearms in there. Under a court situation one time, Costco executives admitted that they don't let their customers know that they have a no gun in the store policy for one reason. They do not want to alienate their NRA members. So it was a catch-22. Eric didn't know that there was no guns allowed in there. So somebody saw it. One thing led to another. A manager talked to Eric, said we have this no gun policy, and it was cordial. Eric said we'll be out of here very soon. I have a legal concealed carry permit. Nobody ever asked him to leave. But Shay Lyerly, this little undercover security guy, I think, this is me talking, I think he took one look at this big redheaded, good-looking guy with a tall model-like girlfriend and said, I will never be that guy, but I got a little bit of power. He called the cops, and then he amped it up. Now, did he intentionally morph this other guy that I call Mr. double, looked a lot like Eric, onto Eric and said, oh my God, the guy that was causing the problem back there has a gun? I don't know how that all happened. Maybe it came together afterwards. But the cops rolled in, as you saw, 15 cop cars, a helicopter overhead, a command team, and an ambulance staged out there. They came to shoot, to kill. They thought they had a nutcase in there. But they asked people to evacuate the store. Didn't announce it over the PA system, just walked around and said, quietly evacuate. So Eric and his girlfriend walked out. Eric had a couple of steps ahead of Samantha. Shay Larley was right next to Samantha. So Eric had already passed the cop at the door, Mosier, and he was standing there, sweating like the proverbial, holding his gun and shaking, according to witnesses. The guy was scared. Shay Larley made eye contact, pointed at Eric and said, that's him. Mosier panicked. He turned rapidly, started screaming. Eric had to stop, turn, assess why this overweight, sweating cop was screaming at him and pointing the .45 at him. And before he could do anything, Mosier shouted 3 conflicting commands and fired, all in 2 seconds. We know that because Larley was still on the phone, so all of that is recorded at the dispatcher. So that's the quick version, and then the cover-up started right after that. They took the gun off the body, still in its holster, placed it on the ground. Almost impossible to pull the gun and the holster at the same time with the way the clips are over the belt and everything. It was an inside the belt holster. Okay. So that happened. The only thing in Eric's hand was that BlackBerry. He always carried that BlackBerry in his hand because he had this big wallet he always carried in the front. And you say, well, why would he carry it in the front? Honest to God. His girlfriend said it made his butt look better. Okay. So they put the gun on the ground. But they needed a second gun now because the ambulance crew said they found one. Uh-oh, how can you have one on the ground and the ambulance crew find one? Had to have a second one. That's why they broke into his condo. They stole 2 guns, one of which has never surfaced. You know, someday it may show up at a crime scene with what the cops call a throwdown. So they do carry extra guns. And if the guy didn't have one, but they needed to make it play right, they throw the gun down. So see, there was a gun. That's why we shot him. Anyway, they got this little Ruger LCP that we know was on the nightstand next to Eric's bed. The girlfriend said it was there when they left. That's what showed up at the inquest hearing later as the so-called second gun. Anyway, that's the quick version. One more factor, the videotape, the video data. Costco had this elaborate security system. But the story was, that DVR that had about 14 cameras associated with it hadn't been working since the Thursday before, and this is Saturday when Eric's killed. Well, here's the real story. The cops left that video data in Costco's hands for 5 days. Then they came to pick it up. And then they tried to, quote, recover the data. Well, wait a minute. They said it hadn't been working since Thursday. Why do you try to recover data if it wasn't working? Oh, by the way, when the IT guy from Las Vegas Metro showed up about 4 hours after Eric was killed, all he did was reboot it and it worked fine. Amazing, isn't it? And as you've heard, this video was later taken down here to LA, had been gone through by the Secret Service's forensic experts. 96% of the data was recovered, but there was some physical damage on the platters. How could that have happened? We asked the expert in court. And he said, as if it were running and they dropped it from about chest high. Physically damaged the platters, only 4% of the data was no longer recoverable. Just happened to be the time Eric was in the store being killed outside. We filed 2 lawsuits, but we quickly learned several quick lessons. Cops lie, especially when they screw up and murder someone. And crooked cops are aided and abetted by the system, the justice system. Especially in Las Vegas. The district attorneys are wired at the hip with the cops, and district attorneys across the nation no longer serve us. Their job, excuse me, is to keep an eye on the cops. There are representatives to do exactly what we would like to have done, keep the cops under control. But the DAs ignore their ethics and the law. And they do it to protect police officers who they do have to work with, understand that. But they're no longer holding them accountable. And that's why cops know there's a 99% chance they'll get away with anything. Besides that, they have this amazing get out of jail free card they call qualified immunity. Never heard of it before until it cropped up in our case. QI, or qualified immunity, is a federal law that says if a cop is accused of doing something wrong, if there are 2 people that said, no, he did exactly the right thing, and there's 100 people that say, no, the cop did something wrong, okay? The court automatically has to give the benefit of doubt to the cops. So if you imagine Lady Justice and her scales, well, the cops have a brick on this scale, and it's up to the families of the victims to try to overcome that. Almost never happens. And the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has a 90% plus record of always finding in favor of the cops. That factor alone was enough to derail our lawsuit. Went nowhere. And finally, as mentioned earlier, powerful police unions have brainwashed citizens into believing that cops are heroes. Some are, but an awful lot of them are not. A lot of them are nothing more than just thugs with badges, and they believe their own hubris nowadays. They get away with it. The bottom line, America's law enforcement and judicial systems have abandoned that ethical behavior. And they're now suffering a very serious crisis of confidence, I feel. So cops who kill and get away with murder, they've absolutely sacrificed America's trust on the altar of self-protection and expediency. So how did we get to this situation where once revered and respected police officers are doing what I just described? Well, I think there's several factors. Number one, they changed. Today's cops are drastically different than the officers that I knew in my younger growing up days. The current generation is an entirely different breed. I call them the 13ers, a term I borrowed from a great book called The Fourth Turning. And the 13ers are the 13th generation of Americans, okay? And as a group, generalized, they're different. For one thing, this is the first generation of cops raised on video games. So think about that. Many of these cops have been shooting and killing everything from aliens to bad guys, you name it, virtually since they were 7 years old. And data research has shown they have literally wired their brains differently. That's why they're so quick to go for the gun. And they just totally bypass all the non-lethal options available to them. So as a result, contemporary policing is anything but what most Americans believe. So allow me to go through some myths versus facts. Myth: police officers have very dangerous jobs that require split-second life and death decisions. You've heard this earlier. According to Labor Department statistics, logging, farming, oil rig roughneck, and being a test pilot are far more dangerous than law enforcement. Law enforcement doesn't even make the top 10 list of most dangerous occupations today. And cop fatalities have been steadily dropping since the 1970s. And the other part, there's always time to think. Yeah, sometimes you have to make snap decisions in seconds. But I'm a little skeptical of that. I tested the airplanes for 12 years. I experienced a lot of critical, life-threatening, time-dependent emergencies. In fact, I even had to jump out of one airplane. And if I had hesitated even a second or two, 3 guys would have died. As it was, 1 did. 2 of us got out. So every flight testing professional knows one thing that cops tend to ignore. There's always time to think. You'd be surprised how much thinking can be done in a fraction of a second. But we always knew in the flight test business, if you didn't take time to think, chances are you're going to do something wrong, somebody's going to get hurt or die. Unfortunately, you've got scared. If you have low IQ cops, they panic and shoot every single time. Here's another related myth. Policing is more hazardous today because there's a war on cops. What a term. Over the past decade, an average of 51 cops were feloniously killed annually. But a December 2014 study by Atlantic Magazine found that police officers interact with civilians about 63 million times per year. Do the math, a cop has about a .008, that's 1/100,000th of a percent chance of being killed in the line of duty. In fact, a cop today is 130 times more likely to be involved in an act of misconduct than to be killed in the line of duty. Another myth, cops have had to arm up with military-grade weaponry because the bad guys are better armed, and they pose a serious threat. There's a certain amount of truth in that, but the fact is there are very, very few instances where cops are totally outgunned like they were in that one situation here in Los Angeles back in the 1980s. But on the contrary, police are so heavily armed now, and they tend to be so aggressive because of the way they're trained, and they're so quick to shoot, that Americans are now 58 times more likely to be killed by a cop than they are a terrorist. One last myth here. Police officers are dedicated to protecting citizens. No, they're not. The courts have ruled that cops are not required to protect us. In fact, every police cadet is taught that officer safety trumps everything else, including our safety. So according to that same article in The Atlantic, police academies now train cadets to believe that everybody they encounter, all of us, are potential terrorists who may want to attack and kill them. Therefore, accidentally killing an innocent person is preferable to taking a chance on a cop being harmed. It's unbelievable, but today's cops run around with this mantra, and every one of them believes it. It's better to be carried, it's better to be tried by 12 than to be carried by 6. So go ahead and shoot. Besides, very little chance anything would happen. The last myth is that police kill more blacks than people of other races. No, the fact is that 21st century cops are equal opportunity killers. Race is a factor, but it's not a primary factor in most cases. And they kill far more whites than they do blacks, Latinos, or Asians, just by sheer numbers. So, recapping, law enforcement has a serious trust problem, and it's of their own making, because they no longer live by a strict code of ethics. And recent trends aren't conducive to a peaceful society that lives by the rule of law, as I see it. Cops are increasingly feared, mistrusted, and viewed as domestic terrorists. Sounds tough, I know, but a lot of people feel that way. Police officers are killing a staggering number of people. I outlined that before, but if you aggregate them, since 9/11, 2001, cops have killed more than 10,000 Americans. That's about 3 times what Al-Qaeda killed on that modern day of infamy. In contrast, in England, cops shot and killed 1 person last year. The year before, 0. They killed none. Something is drastically different here. And one thing that really worries me a lot, I think all of us, is that we're now starting to see outright retribution and deadly backlash against cops. Police officers are being ambushed and killed. Last summer, 5 officers in Dallas were killed outright by one crazy guy. Baton Rouge, 2 other cops were killed that way, and at least 9 other people were injured. What happens? What happens if it's no longer the crazies doing this? What if the average American says, we have no choice but to go after and start hunting cops down? Crazy? Maybe so. But what if we ever get to that point? That is a slick, quick road into chaos. And why? It's because the perception is that cops are never held accountable, and the numbers seem to go along with that. An astute writer a number of years ago claimed that there are 6 evolutionary stages that lead a society to revolution. The first stage is, quote, an advanced erosion of trust and loss of legitimacy. And that's exactly where law enforcement is now. Cops who kill have become a destabilizing precursor to revolution. And America, I think, could really explode in a full-scale rebellion. I don't want to see that. Don't want to see it. So what can we do? What can we do to reverse this current slide toward a police state and restore honor to the law enforcement field? First, after officer-involved shootings, let's stop the silly hand-wringing and politicians' kumbaya calls for calm, and standing together, and then stop promising to do something even if it's ridiculously effective and unconstitutional. It's time to implement real, comprehensive reforms throughout the law enforcement community, such as, first is third-party investigations of every cop-caused fatality. And I think it needs to be based on the National Transportation Safety Board model for investigating aircraft accidents. To expand on what I said earlier, pilots and airlines do not investigate their own accidents. An NTSB GO team of multidisciplinary experts immediately flies to the scene of an accident and takes control of the investigation. Its sole purpose is to determine the cause, not assign fault. And the NTSB's findings are turned over to the Federal Aviation Administration, which has legal authority to take action, whatever is necessary to prevent future accidents. And the system works. Aircraft accidents have decreased by orders of magnitude over the last 80 years. And today's U.S. air transportation system is the safest on earth. Law enforcement needs to also institute another great system from the aviation business we call the Aviation Safety and Reporting System, or ASARS. And why would they do that? So cops can anonymously report misdeeds of their fellow cops. In the airplane business, if Dr. McCord and I are flying together in an airliner every day, and she looks over and says, oh, Bill's doing something stupid every day. He's not using the checklist. He's just kind of on the fly here, this and that. And it's just a matter of time till we have an accident. She has the capability through the ASAR system to anonymously report that. It does not go to the FAA. It goes to NASA, of all people, NASA Ames. They aggregate the data, scrub it to make sure that nobody can be identified, and then they forward it, hopefully with showing a trend somehow, to the FAA, which can take action. Cops don't have anything like that. As you probably heard earlier, that many cops who step up to do the right thing are slam dunked by their buddies. Some of them are even killed. It's ridiculous. And then another thing I think needs to be done is to enact federal statutes that require all law enforcement officers across the nation be drug tested after an officer-involved fatality, especially for steroids. How many of them are all bulked up and running around with roid rage? That's a lot of it. Another thing, obviously, wear body cameras, and they have to buy their own personal liability insurance. Why should all of us, taxpayers, be on the hook for these multi-million-dollar settlements that follow after a cop does something stupid? And the cop goes right back on the street, okay? And he never suffers anything. If you force them to buy their own liability insurance, it's just like car insurance. If they have a lot of bad things happen to them, their insurance rate goes up, pretty soon they're out of the business. And we have plenty of data to back these things up. On body cameras alone, a few years ago when Rialto, California put body cameras on every one of their officers, complaints filed against officers dropped by 88%, and use of force incidents fell 60%. Cameras are a cop's friend and they're citizens' friends. There's no reason not to use them. And then I would like to see zero tolerance for preemptively killing citizens, quote, suspected of being a threat solely in the name of officer safety. And further, cops involved in cover-ups of an officer-involved shooting or other serious misdeed automatically will be dismissed, banned from the law enforcement field forever, and it's subject to racketeering charges. That's what it is. When they all work together to cover up, that's racketeering. And then mandatory annual recertification of every single law enforcement agency in the nation, and that's got to include deep dive background checks, psychological rescreening, and several hours of education about the Constitution, particularly the Bill of Rights. As part of this yearly process, officers having multiple use of force complaints and/or shooting on their record would be subject to dismissal in the name of public safety. We've got to get rid of the loose cannons on the force. They've got to be purged. And then, this is strange maybe, but I'd like to see a federally funded crash program underway to develop, test, and field non-lethal means of subduing suspects. I'm an old engineer, old electrical engineer. And a number of years ago, about 15 years ago, I saw an electromagnetic system in a Huntsville, Alabama laboratory that could create a non-lethal disabling effect at a distance. Okay, and it's still there. It was being worked on for the military. But if a non-lethal weapon like that had been in Bill Mosier's hands on July 10th, 2010, my son Eric could probably be still alive. Instead, he had a .45 caliber, Glock 21 semi-automatic. He fired twice. His first shot went through my son's heart and killed him. And the other 2 cops put another 5 in his back. The other thing I'd like to see is repeal this silly qualified immunity statute. It protects cops from prosecution. It sounds good. Keep cops from being subjected to these frivolous suits, okay? But it has been severely perverted, and it's keeping bad cops on the street. And I put that on the back of the police unions. They're very slick, and they were able to convince good-meaning, well-meaning politicians to put this thing through. It sounded good, but it has really worked against us, the citizens, and it's protecting a lot of bad cops. And then finally, it's up to us. We, the citizens, have got to start taking action to stop the killing. Things you heard before. Hold officers accountable. These days, cops very rarely pay a price for violating the law or violating a citizen's rights. Demand these outside investigations of all use of force incidents. And don't tolerate anymore this paradigm of cops investigating cops and reporting to cops and everything's wonderful. Expose cops' malfeasance. And the way to do that is this powerful tool we have now in our hands, cameras. If you can capture any interaction with a cop and then share that information, don't send it to the cops. It may just disappear on you. But if you share it on social media, with the news media, you'd be surprised how impactful that could be. Last year, we saw Officer Michael Slager murder a black man, Walter Scott, who was running away from him in South Carolina. And Slager, after he killed Scott, he fired 8 times, hit him 5 times, killed him. He said, well, he was trying to get my taser away from me. Fortunately, a bystander was filming the whole thing with a cell phone. And it showed that Slager totally lied. So it went from initially the cops saying, you know, they put out the word, he was trying to do this and that and everything, and the cop had to shoot him. 2 days later, this video footage showed up from the cell phone. All of a sudden they had to backtrack. So what's happened since that time? Slager has been charged with murder. It works. Got to use those phones. And of course, speak out. Flood the politicians' phone lines, emails, demanded every elected official force every cop in the nation to wear a body camera, every patrol car be equipped with what they call dash cams or dash cameras. Encourage local leaders to, sounds crazy, decertify and totally disband powerful police unions. Yes, cops need to be represented. Their interests need to be brought forth too. But there are national organizations, fraternal organizations called Fraternal Association of Police Officers. That would get unions at the local level out of the business of buying politicians. And they do all the time. They fund the politicians' election campaigns, and then they literally own these guys that turn around then and give the cops whatever they want. And then finally, put the fright into cops by instilling fear, doubt, and division in their ranks. Wait a minute, how does a common citizen do that? Well, one way is to spread the word that bad cops are a serious threat to lives, rule of law, and we use this time-proven, powerful force we call entertainment. So, that's the route I went. I wrote this book. It's fiction, and the permit tells what happened to my son Eric. It shows the cover-up, but in fiction, the bad guys get whacked. So here's the plot line. When Las Vegas cops gun down a covert federal agent, they become targets for Checkmate. That's a black ops team of assassins charged with neutralizing terrorists. And very soon, Checkmate's deadly message to these outlaw killer cops comes through loud and clear. You kill, you lie, you die. So the permit is just fiction, yes, but it also sends a not so subtle real-world message. Dirty cops, you will be held accountable. Maybe not by a black ops Checkmate team, but definitely by non-traditional means that rogue cops can't conceive and wouldn't believe if they could. But they're very effective. People like Ramsey and I don't talk about them much, but they work. Nonfiction books and articles. Co-authors Stephen Kuntz and Mike McDaniel have written another book. It's called License to Kill, The Murder of Eric Scott. And we go through the facts of the case, and we prove that it was a massive cover-up and that Eric truly was murdered. It could not have happened the way the cops claim it did. Now, Steve is a well-known thriller writer, 16 best-selling books to his credit, and Mike is a former police officer with considerable investigation experience. We have a very powerful book. It's in the hands of Steve's agent right now. It's being shopped to any number of publishers. But I'd have to say the most powerful form in the entertainment medium for getting a point across, dedicated filmmakers like these guys. They're creating superb documentaries, I think, that expose police malfeasance and corruption, and it's going to be seen by a lot more people than read my books. There's a tremendous breakthrough as far as I'm concerned. 6 years ago, very few filmmakers were paying any attention to this. Now they are. But there's only so much that we citizens can do. Ultimately, law enforcement leaders have got to take the baton and do it themselves, I think. What can they do? Legally rid the ranks of rogues. Get rid of the bad cops. You got to do it. Until you do that, you're not going to restore this trust, this confidence in your law enforcement agency. Abandon political correctness and start hiring smarter cops. This whole idea that, well, we've got to hire somebody, but they have to comply with certain diversity standards doesn't work, folks. You've got to hire the smartest ones, and there's lots of data in the past that supports that thing. And frankly, you can find very good people in every single segment of society. You just got to find them and attract them. But improve the cop candidate screening and training. Make sure the person that you're entrusting with a badge and a gun are good. And improve cop candidate screening and training. Enforce a zero tolerance policy for excessive use of force and lying, and equip every cop with those body cameras, make sure they're always working. But another thing, you said it earlier, respect people and listen to their stories and concerns. Leaders of law enforcement organizations, don't just believe your cops. Listen to the people, hear their story. That's the only way you're going to regain credibility that's been lost. And of course, proactively use outside investigators. Even if there's not a federal law that says you have to, you as leaders can do that. And then indict and imprison every cop who violates his oath by getting involved in illegal activities. Sentences have got to be consistent with what we civilians would go through. That cop, the number 2 guy that put 4 rounds in my son's back, Thomas Mendiola, was fined $2,000. He was fired and turned loose. If you or I had been trafficking in illegal arms, and it wasn't just one gun that he gave to a felon, he was doing this all over the place, including military-grade weapons. But that's what he got off with, $2,000 and a hand slap. Okay, if you or I had done that, we'd be in the slammer for a long, long time. Change police academy training programs. Incorporate in-depth education about the U.S. Constitution and the cop's duty to uphold it. Impress on every police cadet that he or she works for us, the citizens, and ensure every new cop understands that if you protect a fellow officer who does something wrong, both of you are going to get fired. And then institute these annual background checks for every officer. Why? Because a lot of them go bad after they've been on the force for a while, and it's not unprecedented. I worked in highly classified communities. I worked with the National Security Agency as a brand new second lieutenant. We were all subject to that. We were also subject in the nuclear business to something they call the Human Reliability Program. If you were even suspected of being involved in anything unsavory, I saw a guy whose roommate was smoking marijuana in Alaska. He was busted because he said you had to have known about it. Why? They got him out. They did not want him in these highly classified jobs, especially if it had anything to do with nuclear weapons, and it was. And then you pound into every single cop's head before you turn him loose on the street. If you fail to perform your duties, you're inviting retribution against all cops. So if you make a stupid, inexcusable mistake and you kill another human being, that could get you or a fellow officer killed. That's just the facts of the life. And remember, more than 100 million Americans are armed these days, with over 300 million guns. And if it comes down to total chaos in the street, it's not going to be pretty. There's going to be a lot of dead cops out there too. Let's don't go there at all. So why have I spent these last 6 years writing, speaking, campaigning for real police reform? Because I want to stop the killing on both sides, citizens and good police officers, both sides of that thin blue line. I don't want anybody to die. And I want to destroy the cartels of corruption, politicians and commercial big money moguls who literally use cops as their enforcers, in Las Vegas especially. That's exactly the way it works. Cops are the enforcers. The mafia still runs the place, but they don't use Guido, the guy that breaks knees. No, they don't have to. They use cops, bad cops. Now, Randy Titus, that trainer I told you about earlier, he told me that he considers at least 1/3 of Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department officers qualify as bad or rogue cops, and a good percentage of those he considers killers. And he considers 90% of the police force up there incompetent. We've got to restore honor to what was once an honorable profession, that of peace officer. Finally, I personally take Thomas Jefferson's statement seriously. All tyranny needs to gain a foothold is for people of good conscience to remain silent. And to make sure my son Eric didn't die in vain, I can't remain silent. Thank you.